Okay. So I'm going to ask real quick if you guys can hear me adequately. Yes? No? Okay. All right. I don't know if I'm doing the ping correctly. Supposedly 18 people showed interest in this AMA. And it says it pings everyone when you come on stage. I just don't know if that's true. No big deal. Okay. This is getting recorded anyway. So I think I'll just talk like, I guess, a few hundred people will watch it later? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so can you guys hear me in the audience? Yeah, okay. Timas says yes. Timus, how do I pronounce your name? Timas? Timus? Timus? Timace? Is it like Timus? First one? I don't remember which one the first one was. But okay, let's move on. Hey, Alessio, how are you? Okay, so I think what I am going to talk about is I think what I'm going to talk about is I can keep expanding on the idea of a decentralized credit union, or I can talk more about the concepts of I can talk more about the playbook and why we even have this concept of investor teams in the first place, right? So I realize now that I released that playbook actually about a month ago, or at least the preview version, which is still not fully complete. Now, what I don't think a lot of people get right in DeFi, in DLT, you name it, is they don't get right how the shape of their ecosystem should be. They don't get right how the shape of an ecosystem should be. And I've talked about this a bunch. I've talked about this a bunch with even why the ecosystem we're launching here, I guess shortly, has multiple instruments in it that all have relationships with each other, right? So, you've coming from it almost like an ancestry. You have a share coin that has to be staked in order for a peg coin to get printed, right? In order to get the token that interacts with PyreSwap the DEX, you have to have the peg coin, and you have to in fact burn that peg coin to mint one of these other tokens. And additionally, you also have the bond coin, which again, most people don't like right now, but we're going to make them a little bit better coming up here shortly. And the fact that these tokens have these relationships is something that's kind of not being, I think, utilized or understood correctly, because I'm noticing a lot that most people don't even know how a single instrument works, much less instruments that kind of have derivative relationships of each other. I'm not going to expand or expound too much today on the derivative relationship of these tokens, but what I can do is I can at least, I think, highlight probably a situation you guys see in DeFi, elsewhere in DeFi, and it's going to focus on how communities are. and how communities are kind of managed. And for those of you who haven't read a document called the Banneret and Chandler Playbook, let me post this into the big top here. So this was an August preview that I actually released this 30 days ago, and I think that a lot of people didn't like when I posted this because they didn't really understand what part I was talking about. And again, going back to the Revelation Tour, I've only probably shown the public 20% of what was designed for phase 1. So when I came forth with this playbook, I think a lot of people didn't understand how it interacts at all because they had only been shown 20% to begin with. So what this playbook did not have any real adjacency to what they were shown either in December or by the deployment of the dashboards or even the stuff we did in June and July and August. So I think that this probably came across a little tone deaf, but what I want to do is I want to unite this, or rather, should I say, I want to kind of adjoin this idea to, I guess, the pieces that have been revealed to you guys so far. And the reason that we have this separation of community is because this is actually useful for the sake of not putting everybody in the exact same position. Okay, and by position, I legitimately do mean like economic investment position. And the reason being is a lot of people, a lot of finance guys in DeFi, they have a conceptual error that I'm noticing keeps showing up. And they think that the health of the market is the same thing as the health of their position. Okay? They deliberately believe that the health of the market is the same thing as the health of their position, meaning when their bag is green, the market is also doing well. And the thing is, this is not actually true. A market is healthy when it's moving, like when it continues to move, right? In fact, both green candles and red candles are healthy to an actual state of the market. Like it does not need to be, booming for it to be healthy, because boom cycles almost always accompany bust cycles. What the actual health of DLT is probably the long-term curve of growth as opposed to the more short-term booms and busts that perhaps have more of an emotional impact and perhaps resonate with our memory a little better. So I'm looking for these images I was going to show you. One moment. Okay, this one. I'm going to paste this as well. Okay, I'm going to paste these 3 images as well. These are 3 images from that PDF as well, so you can see them as well. So this first image, that goes all the way back to, I think, the original Revelation Tour. And we basically acquired these projects one way or another. Either they were handed to us or they were abandoned. I'm not going to get into the context of all that. But the point being is that the work that was done to create these as investor communities, even these small cultural groups, that does not necessarily make them fungible with each other, right? So I think that a lot of something that's overlooked a lot in DeFi is that while the funds of investors can all get measured as being fungible, the investors behind those funds are not fungible. Does that make sense? Like, so the group of people that we have in the 2 ohm, 3 ohm, Z ohm server, they are not interchangeable with the group that we have like in the DIB server. Does that make sense? Like they're not fungible, right? Like it's not just, oh, this is an investor and this is, they're all the same to us. This is actually the commodification of human beings. And what this ends up doing is overlooking a lot of the value that differentiating them can create. So for those of you who remember, back during the Tomb Fork heyday of 2022, really I think any DeFi project, any DeFi protocol that ends up with a bunch of forks being rendered of it, if these forks are unsustainable, especially if they are Ponzi-nomical and to some degree, you end up with this culture where a whole bunch of them are just like deliberate rug pulls. Like they never had any plan to do anything other than rug pull. And other ones were just like, I guess you could say, experiments that were kind of stitched together by popsicle sticks by a bunch of very inexperienced devs who kind of are just stringing the whole thing along in the first place. And what ends up happening is you get everybody in the same team. You get everybody in the same team, and they all think that they're kind of in the same position, as opposed to perhaps deliberately front running each other. And in fact, perhaps even robbing each other through calculus equations. And some investors were wise to this. And others would, in fact, be, I guess, operating kind of predatorily on this kind of climate, if that makes sense. So people would end up just deliberately destroying these projects. And the fact of the matter is that people didn't know how to fix them in the first place. So they would just launch a new one, right? They would launch a new one. I mean, you guys saw over 400 tomb forks generated, right? And I believe that's what the fork shows. I've been talking about this since January of 2022. There's more money in fixing these than there is in launching new ones, okay? That's what I'm going to stick by, because that's what got me to this level of... that's what got me the audience and the reputation in the first place where I could even undertake this project. So there's more money in fixing these than there is in launching new ones. But of course, you have to know how to fix them. And that was apparently a skill set that was few and far between. So the first thing you need to think about is what actually constitutes a market, okay? Now, in economics and in finance, there's two different definitions of what a market is. And in finance, a market is quite often just like what you see on a chart, okay? Like the stock market, that's a market in finance. But what a market is in economics is a little bit more detailed. And it's going to require that level of economic detail to actually do more things with this concept of DeFi, these tokens, these chains, these dApps, because markets aren't things you can view in 2D. Markets are 4D things. And there has to be differentiation between the actors in order for value to be created in the first place, right? In order for value to actually transact. So why do we have this shape here? This shape right here, okay? Why do we have this shape here? It's because by putting the tokens into different groups, by putting them in groups and then separating the groups from each other, we can effectively create a concept of multiple groups that don't necessarily have the same agenda. And while they can be allied with each other, they can also be directly opposed to other groups. This is totally fine, by the way. This is totally fine. Honestly, I think that people in DeFi who don't create the concept of bears and bulls being antagonistic to each other, they're not going to build anything that can actually... They're not going to build anything that could ever sustain red candles. Like, they're never going to build anything that's not a Ponzi scheme. So in order for you to actually build something that is not a Ponzi scheme, you do need to consider actor and role variegation. So you might be thinking, but I never thought about this detail before. Even in the tomb fork era, there were people that kind of played them different ways. All right. Some people would only deal with the share coin, and they would only swing trade the share coin. Other people, they would only do the liquidity pool in auto compounder. They would only do the first liquidity pool because it had no impermanent loss, right? As long as you were near peg, therefore you were getting APR emission from the share coin, which you were then compounding into a token that was effectively resistant to IL, right? And some people believe that one strategy was better and others believe that the other strategy was better. But the thing there is that the farms all end up dying out. Like the farms were, the farms require an emission table of the share coin that when it's over, there is no longer any incentive to buy or hold or use the peg coin. It doesn't have any point. The whole point of its existence was to remain near its peg, and now that it's failed to do that, it doesn't seem to have any sort of value as an investment vehicle. Okay, so I remember devs in 2022 when I was trying to preach this new philosophy of terminal utility. A lot of devs would say to me when I was describing things that could be built for terminal utility, they would tell me, but people are in DeFi to make money. And I said, then why don't you make financial instruments your terminal utility? And then I realized that none of these devs had ever heard of a financial instrument before. And this led me onto some existential crisis where I realized that the amount of like financial and economic literacy in DeFi had somehow dropped off incredibly, like in the last 7 years. I had never like seen this level before because I guess I had spent more time talking to people who were a little bit more experienced, or I don't know how to describe this. I didn't deal with like the common person playing in this as a hobby. I was immediately in the industry or I wasn't. So the first thing to realize is, do you guys understand that meeting, when I say meeting, I'm talking about meeting Frozen Tomb, for example, higher AVAX. Do you guys understand that this is a financial instrument? Who here has ever heard of an option before? An options contract? And let me make sure that I'm not missing comments in the other chat. Okay, nobody's heard of an option. All right, so I mean, there's an options market, which is like a derivative market, right? It's an option to buy or sell a equity most of the time, perhaps a commodity. This is a very, very, I guess, two-dimensional, or should I say, TradFi limiting idea of an option. Because the fact of the matter is that options historically are much, much more, I guess, robust and less limiting than just the vanilla options that are traded in TradFi. A great example of this is like a lease option where you have a contract to lease something, but there's an option embedded in that contract that you can also buy whatever you're leasing for a pre-agreed price, right? Which is called a strike price. So the meeting utility of the peg coin, the meeting utility is in fact an options contract, okay? It's not an option like you're familiar with, perhaps like a Black-Scholes-Merton option. Rather, this is an option of convertibility, okay? Back in the 19th century, there were three guys who bought up all the war bonds in the United States of America. They bought up like 1/3 of the war bonds. Okay. During the War of 1812, three guys bought up like 1/3 of the national debt, and they held it as war bonds. And these war bonds weren't doing that great. So they actually lobbied politicians to allow their bonds to have a convertibility option directly towards holding shares of the second bank of the United States. So because of the fact that the United States of America was super bad at paying off their debt, they ended up appeasing the rich guys who bought up all their war bonds by letting them hold shares in the national bank. This is kind of a crazy idea, I think, in the modern era. But back then, they were kind of all of the national banks back then were held by like royal families. So it was arguably a bit more decentralized to let a national bank have private shareholders as opposed to like a gigantic conflict of interest, if that makes sense. So looking at the peg coin now, looking at Frozen Tomb, looking at 2ohm, looking at DIBS, it's almost like this is a debt instrument that is just not doing that well. Does that make sense? It's a debt instrument. This is the word I'm using here. Debt instrument. And it is not doing that well, right? They are extremely beneath what their nominal price should be. Does that make sense? And therefore, what are we going to do to make these debt instruments perhaps slightly more redeemable? We're going to embed in that currency, we're going to embed in that instrument a convertibility option, okay? Now, what we do to make sure that this option doesn't run amok is we place limitations on it that are time-based as well as supply-based. So in order for meeting to be available, the time-weighted average price actually has to be beneath 0.8 of its target. So Frozen Tomb can only exercise its convertibility option when it is below 80% of its target price. Okay? And what this does, what we're doing here, is we're creating a valuation paradox that ends up creating price support. Does that make sense? Because if you think of Frozen Tomb, what is Frozen Tomb's peg at right now? Like 0.05 or something? Let me look real quick. Uh-oh, okay. Well, anyway, I'm going to say it's at 0.05 or something like this. Okay, yeah, it seems like it's about near that. So Frozen Tomb right now is at 0.05 TWAP, right? So the scenario, Frozen Tomb is at around 0.05 TWAP. Well, if you're looking for an investment vehicle, if you're looking for something that has the ability to make you money, there's no point in buying that. Does that make sense? Like if all you're thinking about Frozen Tomb, all you're considering about Frozen Tomb, this instrument, this coin, this token, is that it's a fucking useless peg coin, right? Can anybody like list off a reason you would buy a peg coin if there wasn't perhaps a print that was achievable? Would there be any reason to do this if you didn't think that printing was achievable? Right. So everybody would buy, or should I say, people are more willing to buy the peg coin when they use it as something that helps their share coin investment make money, right? So if you can spend a little money to a peg coin that causes the share coin that you have invested to be worth more, you might get ROI out of this investment. But if no matter how much money you throw into it, you're not making ROI out of it, this is a bad investment. And the fact of the matter is the instrument is going to get oversupplied, and the instrument is going to be a shit coin because it has nothing else attached to its contract. And I don't mean contract like smart contract. I mean contract like agreement. Like that instrument has nothing associated with it that is, it has no redeemable value associated with its contract. And I mean contract by saying agreement. So how on earth do you make Tomb Forks work? Well, you have to make the peg coin not a shit coin. In fact, I have a great image for this. And this is also a throwback to the Revelation Tour. Right. The reason Tomb Forks fail, without analyzing anything about decision making and who's doing it, can be boiled down to two factors. And by the way, you should analyze decision making and who's doing it. I don't know if you guys knew that back in December. I was basically insulting every Tomb Fork dev because you should analyze the fucking decision maker. You should analyze who's in charge, because if shit fails and the person in charge quits, it's their fault. Does that make sense? Like really across the board. It's not the worst thing in the world. Some of them, at least allowed me to acquire their projects. Others, not so much. The reason Tomb Forks fail can be boiled down to two factors. The peg coin is a shit coin. The peg coin is oversupplied. Therefore, the way to fix Tomb Forks can be summarized in two objectives. Make the peg coin not a shit coin. Make the peg coin not oversupplied. I'm going to do a quick throwback to when I did things like State of the Market Address, which is where I basically debuted the principle, the design concept, if you will, of terminal utility. I'm going to go through this again, okay? Because I want you guys to know, for those of you who have been following me or have known of me for a little while, I have not changed this. I have not changed this definition at all, okay? The utility has to be intact, functional, and accessible after all initial and temporary utilities and incentives lapse. What that means right there is that this utility cannot involve the farms at all. And I mean the farms where the share coin gets emitted. It has nothing to do with the farm, okay? The utility has to contract the supply permanently without the contraction being analyzed in its cost to the user. A good example of that is, I don't know if you guys are aware, but when you use Avalanche, when you use AVAX for gas on Avalanche, or when you use Phantom for gas on Phantom, or when you use BNB for gas on BNB, did you guys know that either a fraction or all of that gas gets burned? Did you guys know that gas gets burned? 30% of Phantom gets burned in transactions. I believe 100% of Avalanche gets burned in transactions. And I want to say something like 10% to 25% of BNB gets burned. I believe the BNB burn rate gets readjusted every quarter. So I think BNB has a variable burn rate, but did you guys know that all three of those gas coins have terminal utility? Were you guys aware? The utility's value delivery has to accept the currency as a fungible unit of account, regardless of the currency's current transactional value against other assets. No, yeah, Avalanche burns even more. But the thing I like about Phantom is that Phantom is elastic supply. So Phantom expands a little bit every year as well. BNB and Avalanche are deflationary only, which I think a lot of people think that's really good, but it actually is not as good as people. There's a downside to it as well. Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, Ethereum does that now as well, Lesio. Ethereum now burns in the gas. So since Ethereum has shifted its proof of stake, it now burns in gas. Anyway, the utility's value delivery has to accept the currency as a fungible unit of account, regardless of the currency's current transactional value against other assets. What the fuck does that mean? That means that we are valuing this currency as the numeraire. We're not using US dollar as the numeraire. Does that make sense? Like the TU's price is not dollars worth of frozen tune. It is priced in X quantity of frozen tune. Does that make sense to you guys? We're not using the dollar. If you price your utilities in stable coins, you work directly for Jerome Powell. Okay? You are literally Jerome Powell's understudy. I don't know if people even understand that insult, so I stopped using it. But the point being is, you are issuing this currency. This is your central fucking bank. Like, why on earth would you want Jerome's coin over yours? Like, why on earth would you position yourself to imply that Jerome's money is better than your money? Again, the level of instrument knowledge in this space is appalling. And number 4, what that means is the utility ideally has no limit or expiration of the value. What that means is a lot of people would like launch an NFT collection. When I was talking about terminal utility, a lot of these devs were like, oh, do you mean like an NFT collection? And I'm like, well, no, because an NFT collection will run out eventually. Does that make sense? So it's not that it isn't somewhat useful if you want to burn your peg coin by minting NFTs, but then once all those NFTs are minted, now what? All you did is kick the can down the road and you haven't figured out what your fucking job is. So again, people by themselves, meaning a DeFi investor, needs to want to do this completely of their own volition, and that is what needs to contract the supply. I didn't realize this was beyond most people's brains to conceive of. But I mean, I've designed probably like 40 terminal utilities so far. PyreSwap only has a few of them. Blows my fucking mind. Okay. So if you look at something, let's go back to economic markets. If you think about the economic market for gasoline, let's think about the economic market. Actually, let's not do gasoline. Let's do silicon and semiconductors. There has to be a reason and a demand for someone to mine that fucking silicon out of the earth and then sell it to someone who turns it into semiconductor, conductor components, and then sell those components to someone who uses them for chips and processors, who then sells those to someone who builds fucking computers and gadgets with them, who then sells those gadgets to users who use those fucking things to accomplish goals of theirs, whether those goals be recreational or commercial or whatever. Does that make sense? Like you're thinking about an actual supply chain here that drives an economy. Okay, so when somebody is selling something to you, they are in a different position than you. Does that make sense? So again, why are we splitting the investors up into 4 different discords, right? Why are we keeping them arranged this way? Because keeping the investors separate actually keeps them in different positions. Most people, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, most people in these servers, they only talk to the people in their server that they know. They're not like going to the other servers to like make friends. So they right there, they already see something about that community that they find commonality with. They value the other people in there, even if they don't know their real names. They value them because they have commonality. But here's the fucking problem. If everybody in an economy has the exact same position, you don't have transactions. You don't have transactions. So let's look at who we have here in the audience today. So let's see. Okay, we have Timas and Alessio, and we'll just say Alessio and Timas. Okay. Yes, I will upload this AMA to YouTube. Yes, absolutely, I will. Yeah. Thank you for asking. Okay, so Alessio, if Alessio and Timas here, I'm gonna tag you guys here in the big top. Alessio and Timas were both vegetable farmers in a village, and they both grew broccoli. Would Alessio and Timas ever trade with each other? They certainly wouldn't trade broccoli, at least not that much. If anything, they would be biased towards thinking the broccoli they themselves grew was the better broccoli. Okay? In order for you to actually consent to trading with something for anything, you actually have to believe that what you're getting is better than what you're giving. Does that make sense? So if Alessio is a broccoli farmer and Timas is a broccoli farmer, they spend all year like perfecting the art of growing broccoli. Okay? Like their fathers were broccoli farmers and their fathers before them. They're spending decades and decades of their life just dialing in that broccoli. Yeah, exactly. Because you have your own broccoli and he has his own broccoli. So it's like, first of all, Alessio, your family, you guys grow broccoli different than him, And like, if anything, like what are the things that you could possibly trade? It would be like, oh, maybe one of you has a tool the other one doesn't have, or maybe you guys want to, it would be something not related to broccoli. Does that make sense? But here's what would happen though. If Timas suddenly decided he was going to stop farming broccoli and farm carrots and potatoes instead. Okay, if Timas, now he decides he's going to stop farming broccoli and farm carrots and potatoes instead, now consider this scenario, okay? Because Timas, now he has all the carrots and the potatoes he wants, right? Does that make sense? But guess what Timas does not have? Can anybody guess? This is a really easy question. If you've been doing the bare minimum amount of listening, you should know the answer to this. If Timas switches it up and he farms carrots and potatoes now, what does Timas no longer have? Broccoli. Thank you so much, Alessio. Your participation has always been stellar. Okay, so think of it this way now. Alessio, he has broccoli. Yes, exactly. Because now you're like, oh, you know what? I have so much broccoli. I literally have a farm, like I have a barn full of broccoli. I have broccoli I have 15 carts of broccoli. Does that make sense? Alessio, your job is to get rid of this broccoli. Does that make sense? So what are you interested in? You're interested in people who want broccoli. Does that make sense? And guess what? You're interested in getting things that aren't broccoli. Does that make sense? So guess what you can now get, Alessio? You can now, both of you benefit from trading with each other, because whatever ratio you decide, right? Whatever vegetable ratio you guys decide and agree to, this is a mutual profit because it is a voluntary exchange. both of you, because Timas is getting broccoli in exchange for potatoes, and you're getting potatoes in exchange for broccoli. Both of you guys are winning from this because both of you guys have way too much of the thing you're giving away. Does that make sense? Like, you want the thing you don't have, and you don't want the thing that you do have. So, what this does, by the way, Alessio, consider this. Since Timas is now a broccoli buyer, since Timas has now been converted from a broccoli seller to a broccoli buyer, when the broccoli market actually, okay, let's put it this way. Let's say Alessio, unbeknownst to him, in the town over, Charlotte is a broccoli farmer, okay? And next year, Charlotte has a huge yield. She yields 10 times as much broccoli as she has done in the past. What happens to the price of broccoli? Who here can tell me, and how is this going to affect Alessio? You know, Timas, right? Timas, who remembers, you know, how Alessio was always cruel to him when he was just trying to make it as a humble broccoli farmer in the broccoli game. He decides he is going to buy the dip on this broccoli with Charlotte. Does that make sense? So I don't know if you realize this. From Timas's perspective, does he benefit more from red candles or green candles on the broccoli chart? What about Alessio? That's a real question, yeah. I will just stand here in silence. Yes, Alessio benefits from green because he's a seller. Yeah, Alessio benefits from green. What about Timas? Because he's a broccoli buyer. Yeah, Timas benefits from red. Okay, so something that's economically illiterate across DeFi is how on earth could a red candle be good? It's like, well, it's good if you're a buyer. And the thing is, since nobody ever thinks about like what are the utilities you can make for a fucking coin, like in the Web3 or Web2 environment, that is actually a financial instrument, by the way. Does that make sense? What I fucking love about Senyard's protocols is that the share coin, aside from the fucking pump and dump, nonsense of the chart, is that it is an actual financial instrument that allows you to collect prints, right? Senyard prints when it is staked. Like, it has a conditional instrument embedded into it. Does that make sense? I need you guys to understand something. DeFi is never going to evolve past pump and dumps if you guys don't figure out how to make money or generate money or turn these into financial instruments in more complicated ways. And the thing is, like, this information is not being gate kept. You can just kind of Google this, but I guess nobody knows how to like look things up besides me. I'm not going to get into that. Okay. So if you're thinking about like, oh, hey, the share coin, right? Like if you're thinking more about the share coin, about like staking it for prints, there's a reason to buy it if you think that the prints are going to happen again. What defines a financial instrument in this context? Great. It involves an agreement, actually. It involves kind of like it literally just means a pre-solidified agreement or ability that is, I guess, in a traditional sense, contractually outlined. Does that make sense? So things that are financial instruments are things like leases, like renting is a financial instrument. Insurance is a financial instrument. An option is a financial instrument, right? Things like things like equities, like shares, like ownership is also a financial instrument. Derivative instruments like stocks, bonds, et cetera, and of course, currency is also a financial instrument. But there's even things beyond that. Anything that's really agreed that can in fact affect some sort of financial outcome is also a financial instrument. Let me think about that right there. So if, let's say you have like this, a tontine. Have you ever heard of a tontine? Who here knows what this word means? Yeah, okay. A tontine is an extremely exotic and rare and mostly illegal financial instrument. Okay, a tontine was a historic financial instrument where a group of old men would pool their money together, and whoever was the last alive would get it all. And this was outlawed in a lot of countries because it incentivized murder. I don't know why I think that's so funny, but that is a historic financial instrument. Yeah, it is creative. Yes. Believe it or not, Pega, I guess creativity is required to conceive of the idea of financial instruments. You can think about financial instrument as like it's any type of weird bet. Okay. So like life insurance. Do you know how life insurance works? A tontine is actually like a prototype to life insurance. So life insurance is an interesting bet because you're basically making the bet. You're kind of betting that you won't live forever, but the life insurance company is willing to take that bet in the sense that you start insulating their exposure over time. Right? Because they do not have a derivative or underlying component to them. Meaning they're not built. Yeah, they're not built from a place of financial instrument literacy, if that makes sense. So like for instance, nodes or whatever, right? Nodes, like you're just effectively like making this weird fucking bet that other investors will end up like picking up the tab for you, and you can end up front running them all. Does that make sense? So, yeah. Okay, if you look at like Bitcoin and stuff, and like a lot of, I guess, even blue chip currencies, they're almost like a socialized debt volume. Does that make sense? Like that's some of the most effective ways you can look at it, right? There is a hard money value to Bitcoin and stuff like it, but it has a utility value as well, though, right? It has a utility value, meaning it can be used as gas on its own chain. Does that make sense? So having a utility value is also, I think, what's even more important than having an embedded instrument. But the thing is a lot of people, at least on the DApp level, if the investors are only in this for money, then you can just make terminal utilities financial instruments. Does that make sense? Like you can just create derivative upon derivative upon derivative of random ass instruments that are embedded all in your fucking peg coin. That is actually how Circus DAO is designed. More on that later. And it's from these other instruments being undervalued that you end up fixing the price chart, right? Because the peg coin as an instrument, the only point of its existence is to beat over peg, so therefore the share coin will print. Does that make sense? But again, like that money has to come from somewhere as well, or rather that value has to come from somewhere. And eventually it will spiral out because it doesn't have any sort of correction to it. It doesn't have any angle that it can be interpreted from where this being where red candles can be good. Does that make sense? There is no scenario in DeFi protocols where red candles can be good. Does that make sense? Because there's no reason to buy the coin. Does that make sense? If the returns are always like diminishing and like they're inflationary, then they effectively erode the return on that a while. You could interpret them that some of them are financial instruments, but they're not designed to be good ones. Does that make sense? Like now that I'm thinking about it, like yes, some of them could be considered financial instruments, but they're not like very good ones. Like they're pretty trashy ones. And again, yeah, 100%. And again, Pega, governments like Argentina and Venezuela and Zimbabwe, they do that with their currency too, right? Like even people in TradFi, they are not literate. Yeah, exactly. They're not really literate of financial instruments. And again, I realize this will help the Semi-Rich Circus do a lot of interesting things here in DeFi on the DApp layer. The point being is, why would you buy something after a streak of red candles, right? Like you must believe there's going to be a bounce, right? But there should be something that makes that bounce kind of like, there should be something that bounce is derived from. So how do we fix these fucking peg coins, right? How do we fix these fucking peg coins? We basically give these peg coins access to a very sort of exotic convertibility option. Again, an exotic convertibility option where suddenly these coins are now underpriced. Does that make sense? It gives you a different angle to interpret these peg coins from. Does that make sense? Because, the share coin, like if we look at the share coin, yeah, you know what? I fucking hate the second one. Yeah, I don't want, like, I think that the reason that you don't see me fucking driving too much hype as we get very close to beta, by the way, which is probably less than a month away. Is that what you guys wanted to hear? That beta is less than a month away? Okay. It is. It has been remarked to me that it is we have an over 50% chance of being less than a month away. Okay, there, I said it. That's what you guys wanted to hear, right? All it took was 54 minutes. Okay. If we look at the share coin, yeah, because Pega, this is crypto. There's always going to be crypto winter. You know what I mean? So how on earth do you make something work both in summer and in winter? Because again, the health of your bag is not the health of the market. The health of the market is something that keeps breathing, keeps kind of moving. Does that make sense? So let's say Charlotte flooded the market with cheap broccoli. Does that make sense? And because of this, Alessio was not able to sell as much of his for the price he wanted. Does that make sense? So maybe Alessio didn't eat as well that year. But you know what Alessio can do? Alessio can take half of his broccoli field and he can start growing tomatoes. Does that make sense? So Alessio can actually now get out of, he can reduce his exposure to broccoli and he can in fact start growing tomatoes. And now suddenly he has a completely separate value add where now red candles don't hurt him as much. Does that make sense? Because Alessio can now change his position. Whereas now if Timas wants to buy broccoli from him, Alessio can now charge a higher price because he doesn't have that much of it anymore. And he says, if you want it so bad, you can go to the next town where Charlotte has it, buddy, right? If you look at the share coin, again, it had its swing trade value, but it also had the print value, right? It had an embedded instrument, right? The fact that the share coin kind of, if it was staked in the boardroom, you were entitled to pro rata seigniorage. That is a contract. That is a financial instrument. Does that make sense? So the share coin's price action. Do you guys remember the share coin price when these things would get repegged? Like during the Seigniorage Circus campaigns, we would repeg some fucking projects here and there, but the share coin price would quadruple. You know what I mean? Like it would just go whoosh to the fucking moon. Yeah, exactly, because it's a derivative. The share coin is not only its own, coin, but it's also a derivative of the peg coin when the peg coin is above peg. Does that make sense? And guess what? Now the mead coin is not only its own coin, but it's also a derivative of the peg coin when the peg coin is below 0.80. So think of it this way. Now there's a reason to sell and now there's a reason to buy. Because the person who's doing the selling is not thinking about the same thing the person doing the buying is doing. Does that make sense? Like Timaz, Timaz who grows carrots and potatoes, he's not thinking about how much he hates the taste of broccoli. He's thinking about how much he likes it because he doesn't get to taste enough broccoli because all he grows is carrots and potatoes. Whereas Alessio, he eats only broccoli, so when he gets carrots and potatoes, he likes them a lot because of the abundance versus scarcity. Yeah, derivative meaning where it gets its value from. Derivative is like derived from. Yeah, that's derivative. Derivative just means derived from. Okay, so there are two major, I think, types of instruments. One is underlying and the other is derivative. Okay, so an LP token is actually derivative of its two underlying tokens carried in liquidity. Does that make sense? So it's like a layer, okay? So like the share coin, right? The share coin is its own coin, right? It's a fucking ERC20 token. Yay, it's emitted over a farm, blah, 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 blah. But what the fuck is the point of it? The point of the share coin is that when the peg coin is above peg, the share coin, you don't just have to throw it into a fucking farm. You can also stake it in the fucking boardroom and then collect prints, right? There's more than one thing you can do with your share coin. Does that make sense? So that's why the fucking share coin would fucking quadruple in price when it would go above peg, because not only did it have its own farm coin value, now it had two instruments active at the same time. So when the share coin is able to be used both in farms as well as the boardroom, what this does is activates it having two uses at the same time. And this is what causes it to fucking moon. Okay? So do you guys know my fundamental valuation formula? Here, let me paste this. Okay. This is going to be renamed to Phi's general valuation model, by the way, because it is not technically a formula. Okay, so VU in this context, when peg coin is above peg, it means that VU for a share coin is both. Does that make sense? So it has both utilities toggled on the same time, and then it goes whoosh, like it just has more utility for it is in fact activated at the same time. Oh, by the way, after phase 1 of PyreSwap, there's phase 2, there's phase 3, there's phase 4, and there's phase 5. Every single one of them pretty much has more utilities for the peg coin and the mead coin. Oh, and in phase 5 even has more utilities for the share coin. Did you guys know that? No, you guys didn't know that. It's fine because I would much rather just focus on talking about phase 1 because that's the one we're about to step into. Talking about phase 2, 3, 4, and 5, it gets really fucking crazy. But stuff has been designed for all of it, and it might as well have been. Yeah, and I apologize. I guess Pega. I would much rather focus on the step in front of us, if that makes sense, as opposed to talking about what comes next after that. Because I built a roadmap for 2023 back in December and January, and I was hoping we could have maybe like 6 times as much done in 2023 as we're getting done. But I believe people say that you overestimate what you can do in 1 year and underestimate what you can do in 10 years. So the good news is we're about to accelerate ourselves kind of the same way that a share coin does when the peg coin goes above peg. And that's something to look forward to. Okay, so the reason that we have team captains, right? Pega, you read through this document and you were like, well, is it truly decentralized if there's captains? Well, first of all, the captains do not have any like privilege or power that any other DeFi investor doesn't have. Does that make sense? The captains are kind of like mods that are kind of in charge of keeping the investors aligned with each other. And the reason being is because if there isn't an enemy, right? Knights are, at war with witches. If you do have an enemy, it's very, very easy to actually keep a team, to keep unit cohesion, right? If you remember reading that book, book 1984, right? Do you remember how the government is always at war with one of the other countries, and then nobody can ever remember like how long we've been at war, or it's just that we've always been at war with them, and the other country is the ally? Well, Orwell thought of that as dystopian, but believe it or not, humans kind of evolved to kind of be tribalistic. So Pega, you over there in 2-ohm, 3-ohm, and Z-ohm, and Alessio, if you guys, I want you to know something, Pega, if I was not willing to provide a antagonistic volume to you guys over there, you and Alessio would actually be enemies, even if you don't realize it. Like if you don't realize it, it doesn't change anything. Both of you guys affect each other's bags, and if you're only playing a pump and dump, meaning if there's only one door of value in and out of this sort of ecosystem, then you're basically just kind of like robbing each other with a calculus equation. Does that make sense? So like the only way to actually and genuinely make you and Alessio and Timos allies is to actually let's just be explicit. Let's just make other investors the antagonists. Like DeFi is basically like sports anyway, right? Do you know what I mean? I want you guys to know the knights and the witches concept. This is a skin. This is like an aesthetic to the ecosystem. You could take this aesthetic away and it would still work. But the reason we have this is because, as you guys are aware, people who love sports, they begin to identify with however that team is named. Does that make sense? So people who really, really have a favorite sports team, they will, in fact, decorate themselves with the colors of that team, right? Like they become identitarian with that fight. Does that make sense? So all professional athletes, they can get traded to a different team, right? And then it's just part of the game, right? Like, oh, I was playing for that team before, and now I'm playing for this team, right? They still need to take their job seriously, but if they're not taking competition seriously, they're all think of it this way. Think about if you were playing football, but everybody was on the same team. There's 2 goals, but everybody's on the same team. Eventually, you're going to figure out who's on your team and who isn't. You know what I mean? Maybe that's a bad metaphor. The point being is you need to diversify roles. And that's why we made Timos a potato and carrot farmer. And that's why we had Alessio start growing tomatoes. So if we create more things and more variety in what you can do, well, if you create more things and you create more variety in what you can do, there ends up being a justification for actually doing business with each other. Yeah, I noticed it wasn't Apple. Maybe you want to be an apple orchard farmer. Alessio, it's fine. It's fine. Whatever you want to grow, Alessio, it's your farm, okay? It's your farm. Okay. So why do we have these team captains? Okay. Tribalistically, people, when they're confused, they look to a leader to answer their questions. Does that make sense? I don't know if you guys have figured out the way that I look at DeFi, but I look at DeFi like I'm looking upon a sea of people who don't even know what their hand in front of their face would look like, right? They couldn't recognize, I don't know, their own nose. And if you look at DeFi projects, right, they always go awry. And what do the investors do, right? The investors look towards a leader who can explain why there's a problem. Does that make sense? Would you guys agree that when something goes wrong in DeFi, the investors are looking to somebody who can explain what's wrong? Somebody who has a reason, somebody who has an explanation? Okay, so the point being is being a banneret. Being a banneret is a lot like being 5 in the SC during Q1 and Q2 of 2022. You don't own the protocol, right? You don't own the project, but everyone is supposed to listen to you. Okay, sorry. That's funny to me, at least. But yeah, again, you guys are going to get trained, specifically, I guess, Pega and Alessio. Specifically, I know I've talked to both of you guys about banneret, being a banneret. The point being is you guys are going to understand all of the ways that you can be positioned in order to actually grow your own investment in a way that's not Ponzi-nomical. Does that make sense? There are a lot of things beneath the surface that are not necessarily clear right away. They'll be clearer in October. But there are certain things about these tomb forks now where if you do them the wrong way, you might end up screwing up your own investment, right? You might end up sabotaging yourself. Or you might end up having the wrong time preference. And if you get this right, by the way, this is not that hard to do. These are very simple rules to live by. If you get this right, you're actually able to continue to grow your share coins to any price you fucking want. I'm assuming both of you guys hold a shit ton of share coin of at least the boardrooms in the 203 server. The point being is there are if you think, okay, once I give you guys the proper training on how to think of the PyreSwap ecosystem as a decentralized credit union, you guys will realize that even though you're considered bannerets and you guys are considered captains of the knights, what you guys are actually doing is you are helping a bunch of junior bankers learn how to manage a volume of credit, okay? And the volume of credit are the peg coins themselves, okay? And the peg coins, they effectively, when they are above 0.8, they are considered good debt, right? The peg coins are considered good debt when they are above 0.80 T1, and bad debt when they go below 0.80. As bad debt, they begin to get consolidated into PyrePhantom, which is a debt consolidation volume. Okay? So PyrePhantom has different utilities than the fucking peg coins. Does that make sense? It's a different token, it has a different job, and it's a different type of debt. This is how banking works in real life as well. Okay? Debt has certain classifications. Okay? When it gets that low, it's bad debt, and the debt starts getting consolidated so it can be instrumentalized a different way. So the way that PyreSwap, distributes DEX fees is through the bad debt consolidation instrument. Does that make sense? And in the aesthetic sense, we call this the incantation, right? Right. This is effectively the way that the debt consolidation instrument can be deployed for the sake of ROI, right? However, it is called the incantation because it is easier to explain the setting of a fantasy video game to DeFi investors than it is the way that actual banking works. Does that make sense? So to be brutally honest, PyreSwap does not need all of this aesthetic at all, but I don't believe that the average investor would ever figure out what I don't think they would understand me if I started using the finance and economics word. So I have to dress it up by using an allegory of, knights fighting witches and stuff like that. Okay. Does that make sense to you guys? I hope that makes sense. Let me check the other chat to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. Okay. Yeah, 100% Leviathan, because they feel like they're out of control, right? So it's almost like our own inner child comes to the surface, where we start looking for who our parent is. We start looking for who our daddy is. Anyway, so being a banneret, I believe we do give you some sort of moderator powers and stuff. But the point of it is that bannerets need to be investors who at least get trained on some of the intricacies and some of the stuff that isn't that obvious about how some of this works. So before in a classic tomb fork, when a boardroom printed, what was the next thing that everyone did? Yeah. Bought shares. Okay, interesting. I mean, even before then, but so Pega, what did you do? What did you sell to buy those shares? I zoom in a lot closer here, by the way, than the average person. What do you buy? How are you buying those shares? What are you selling to buy those shares? The boardroom just printed and you bought shares. Okay, what did you buy the shares with? Right, correct. And how did you get that peg coin? From the boardroom, right? That's your printed. That's the peg coin that just printed. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Alessio. Thank you. Yes. So, not sure if you're aware, but before, basically all the boardroom stakers were in a contest to front run dump their prints in front of the other boardroom stakers. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Because the first one who dumps the print is getting the highest price for that print. It might have been hard to notice this because the farms were active, so therefore you always had like the share coin. The share coin was getting fucking sold on top of the peg coin. So, but if you think about it with that being eliminated, let's say peg is 1.05 TWAP, and a print happens. Okay, Alessio wants to sell before Timos, so he gets 1.05 Phantom for each of his 2 ohm, whereas by the time Timos sells, he will only get 1.03 Phantom for his. Do you guys understand what I'm saying here? Okay, so yeah, so you know what? I don't think about the difference is actually not minimal when the farms are off. By the way, yeah, when you it might be difficult to simulate this because in your memory the farms were always on when this was happening. I dissect activity to a much more granular level. Does that make sense? So when you have farms active, it can be difficult to realize this, but you understand that this is still economically true, right? Whoever sells at the highest price, and normally the highest price is going to be the first person who sells the print, right? If you have no farm at all, remember, if you have no farm at all, there's no buy pressure for the share coin. You know what I mean? Right? The only reason there would be buy pressure on the share coin, buy pressure on the peg coin. If you have no farms running, right? The farms, they kind of apply pressure to the peg coin because the share coin is getting sold for it. You know what I mean? But the point being there is if you don't have that running, like if you don't have any sort of arguably Ponzi-nomical buy pressure to the peg coin, you know what, Alessio? That's a great question as well, and you're not wrong. You're not wrong. I am going to actually explain more about. I'm going to explain a lot about this exact scenario because both you and Pega are going to learn even more about this shit in the next 30 days. Okay, so do you know why? Do you know why? Okay. Let me also point something else out. First of all, I want to acknowledge that Charlotte said made more LP. Do you guys see where Charlotte said made more LP as the answer right there? And the reason Charlotte says that is because at the time, what actually could you do with the peg coin? Does that make sense? Like you could dump it or you could pair it, right? Like these are the only 2 things you could possibly do. Does that make sense? Do you guys ever remember any fork? I mean, sometimes they had weird things like you could stake it for its like X version, right? Or whatever. Or like sometimes they had like single stake farms for the peg coin, etc. Right? Do you guys remember us fucking around with single stake farms for the peg coin? Do you guys remember this? Okay. So again, farms are gone, and we do not have this weird like X coin thing. So again, you have what? You have sell your prints. and you have 2, you have fucking pair them in LP, incentivized by farms. Okay. So now, this scenario before was when there was a single tomb fork. Okay. Now you have a trifecta of tomb forks. 3 boardrooms. So now, even with the okay, remember the meeting terminal utility does not toggle on until you're below 0.8. So let's say you have prints. So now you have prints from the boardroom. But there is no farms. And TS is contracted. And phase 2 of PyreSwap, has not started yet. And liquidity is super tight because that is, unfortunately, how we have to fix these things in phase 1. So you just have prints. And I want you guys to know something. In phase 1, when you guys see the first print, it's going to, in my mind, I think it's going to hit like a fucking hammer. Like it will be a gigantic red, like sledgehammer fucking candle. Does that make sense? Now, it doesn't need to be. Now, the thing is, here's the good news. It's probably not going to go below 0.8, 0.75, or 0.7 TWAP. Does that make sense? Because it's around the time that it's at 0.7 where suddenly now this coin can be considered undervalued again. Does that make sense? It's not considered undervalued to the person who got it at the time of print, but it can be considered undervalued to the person who was not in position when that happened. Does that make sense? So it can be considered undervalued to somebody who's not in the business of selling broccoli. Okay? But again, it's not just one boardroom, it's 3 boardrooms. So let's say, for whatever reason, all 3 boardrooms print at the same time, and Alessio and Timas and Pega are in the Banneret chat, and they don't know what to do. What can you do with these? What can you do? Okay. What can you now do with these coins that make them effectively another type of financial instrument that was not necessarily available before? And the thing here is you can do this and you'll avoid red candles completely. Meaning if you get good at doing this, meaning I want you guys to know as the bannerets, if you guys get your knighthoods under control, you guys can figure out how to collect print after print after print after print, and they'll each get bigger than the one before them. And by the way, we are not below 0.8. We're still at like 1.05 or whatever printing TWAP is in your mind. Do you want me to tell you the answer? Okay. You can now pair them in LP against each other. So 2 ohm, 3 ohm, LP, 3 ohm, Z ohm, LP, and Z ohm, 2 ohm, LP. Now, remember, these are tokens that, if it's not clear to you guys, I am designing the PyreSwap greater ecosystem that these tokens have more transaction value than any other than any other DEX out there in the EVMs. Okay, I want you guys to understand. I am designing PyreSwap so that it has more transaction volume than any other DEX. Okay, like transaction volume as a ratio against TVL. That the PyreSwap model drives more transaction volume than any other DEX. Okay, so you can now pair them in LP against each other. And the thing is if you guys aren't aware, 2 ohm, 3 ohm, and Z ohm, because they're elastic coins, they're actually going to be deployed in LP against all blue chips. So on the DEX, they're going to be deployed against all blue chips. Why? Because they help manage liquidity. They are really stepping into their role that they mentioned a long time ago in the Tomb Finance documents. Remember when they were solving a liquidity problem? Well, believe it or not, if you give them terminal utility, they will actually solve a liquidity problem. So all of these tokens have another use case. That use case is more so from the perspective of the DEX, which is me, right? I'm the DEX. What do these tokens solve? These tokens can solve a real liquidity problem if they get deployed in such a manner. So the point being is these tokens are kind of the same. Does that make sense? 2 ohm, 3 ohm, and Z ohm. They are most likely going to, bounce between like 0.70 and 1.10 TWAP. Does that make sense? Do you guys understand why it would do that? They're not going to bounce fast all the time, and by the time we get to phase 2, they'll be kind of slow. But do you guys understand why it would bounce around that range? Not exactly 0.7 and 1.01, but I mean a little under. What I'm going to say is it will find support below 0.80, and it will find resistance above 1.01. Does that make sense? So it's not exactly 0.7 and 1.1, but it will find. Okay, Charlotte understands. Can I get a yes from anybody else? Okay, so here is Pega. Have I told you about how the expansion rates are going to work for the boardroom? Let me see if I can find this. Have I told you about the expansion rates? Okay, so I will reiterate that. 2%, 3%, 4% expansion rate for 2 ohm, 3 ohm, Z ohm. And this will be mirrored, of course, for Frozen Tomb, Snow Tomb, and Affogato, as well as Dibs, Ribs, and Hoggy. For those of you who are who don't like the fact that we use the Phantom Trifecta for our allegory. The reason we use the Phantom Trifecta as our allegory is because all 3 of these tokens already exist. The other tokens will come during phase 1, so you'll see them perhaps also in October, but maybe more realistically November or something like that. And they'll be added in later once we figure out the right way to do that. But a lot of people don't know that, so they I think it's easier for people to consider this with tokens that already exist. So we're not going to make the expansion rates equal to each other, Pega. And the reason we're doing that is because I want these tokens to have slight differentiation with each other. So one, that's why they have different pegs, right? So we're changing the 3 ohm peg to 0.1 phantom, and we're changing the Z ohm peg to 0.01 phantom, right? And while that effectively doesn't change anything, that doesn't change anything relevant, but it makes them slightly different, at least like in the way that they'll behave. Does that make sense? And these expansion rates, by the way, expansion rate is measured daily, but the print does that make sense to you? And this is, of course, 2 bonds in circulation, right? That means that 2 0.5% per epoch. Does this make sense? And it means that 3 ohm will print at 0.75% per epoch, and it will imply that Z ohm prints at 1% per epoch. Okay? Okay. 2% divided by 4 equals 0.5%. 3% divided by 4 equals 0.75%. 4% divided by 4 equals 1%. So expansion rate is a daily, but epochs are but the print rate is per epoch. Does that make sense? So these are the expansion rates, but per epoch it breaks down like this. Does that make sense? So you might be wondering, why did we add this variety? Oh, exactly. So they wouldn't be the same, Pega. That's why. So guess what that means? It means when 2 ohm prints, it's not going to crash below peg right away. Does that make sense? But when Z ohm prints, it'll fucking crash below peg. Does that make sense? Yes, exactly. Correct, sir. However, Pega, it's possible. Okay, it is possible they will equalize over time. You know why? Because bonds will be in liquidity. Oh, yes, what a great question. All contraction rates are up to 1% per epoch through the Meade, right? Through the Meade terminal utility. So, okay, because bonds will be in liquidity, they might end up equalizing. Does that make sense? I'm not going to get into why that will happen, but it's something that could happen just because of the way that markets behave. So here's what needs to be kind of understood by the bannerets. Expansion rate is a percentage of total supply, okay? So in order for the next print to be larger than the print that just happened, what needs to happen or not happen to total supply? And this is just a number. This is like a going up or going down. Must be low enough. Okay. That actually is a separate. That is a separate contraction. But I'm talking about just meaning. And again, total supply. What is only talking about 2 ohm, 3 ohm, or Z ohm. So right now, I think 2 ohm has like 6 million total supply. Okay, so every Meade epoch can have as much as 1% of that burn. Okay, and every print epoch will have as much as 0.5% of that print. Does that make sense? So if meeting outpaces printing, what direction is total supply going? If printing outpaces meeting, what direction is total supply going? Indeed. And if printing outpaces meeting, it would go up, correct? Okay, correct. So, did you know, Pega, that the APR of share coins in the boardroom is measured in their market price against the pro rata size of the print they will receive? Yep. So it's measured. That's measured in numeraire, right? It's measured. Yep. Exactly. So Pega, this will effectively be the market kind of arriving at a conclusion. Okay. And what I mean by that is, if the print at epoch, 2000 is 50 grand, or let's say 50 grand, but then two needs happen, and then the print at epoch 2015 is 48,500. What is going to happen to the share coin, even though nobody can figure out why? I'm talking about the share coin's price, by the way. If the amount getting printed is getting smaller, what will likely happen to the price of the share coin? You're correct, Pega. You're very correct. The degen, as they are called, enjoy to see a 1% daily-ish type of APR, right? So what they are going to do is they are going to, swing trade the share coin and do all kinds of weird, other nonsense. And what will be arrived at is a price of the share coin that makes the APR look attractive enough to the I guess the dumbass. Sorry, to the investor. Does that make sense? So if the price of the share coin goes up, yeah, exactly. So if the price of the share coin goes up, but prints don't get larger, it's like APR is actually going down. If the price, if the price of the share coin goes down, but prints do get larger, the APR is going up. Does that make sense? So this is like a balancing act. Does that make sense here? Because you do understand what I'm saying? Okay. What about, let's see, who else is still here? What about you, Alessio? Do you understand what I'm saying? Oh, okay. Well, hope you get that taken care of. Anyways, so being a banneret will actually involve manually controlling LP on the DEX, because the goal for anybody who is a share coin whale is to grow the price of their share coins while also balancing the credit volume of the investors and keeping it as good debt. Basically, you want prints to outpace needs. If prints outpace needs and total keeps growing net, then sharecoin price can literally go above $8,000 or whatever, right? If the bannerets get that good, it is possible to do this. Does that make sense? I say $8,000 because everybody remembers 2Share touching $8,000 in that big drama that happened in 2022, right? Now, is it going to happen in 2023? I don't know if we'll see 2Share. They need to take about 70% of their prints and pair them into LP manually. This should be an easy. Okay, so this way. This is a volatile liquidity pair, and it has IL mitigation. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand? Do you understand why pairing two peg coins against each other does not really experience that much IL, because it always is going to the coins are always going to converge in price again. You understand what I'm saying? So this is a very IL resistant pair, so it's not that hard to kind of expose yourself to it. Does that make sense? It's also great because keep in mind, Phantom is 20 cents right now. So as Phantom gets back to $2 eventually, these LPs will also shoot up in fucking value, and both coins will. You know what I mean? So if you're pairing 2 ohm against 3 ohm, both of those coins will through the meeting terminal utility. Again, they're not gonna rocket up at the same speed as Phantom, but they will climb up after it. Does that make sense? They'll climb up at the same speed. You'll watch probably faster actually, but they will climb up at like a delayed speed, and that's the way that they're designed to do this now. So about 70% of the prints ought to get manually LP'd by knights, by good knights and bannerets. The other 30% can be sold, dumped, swapped for more share coin, whatever. We the SC, the Gefiscus per se, will always do between 70-30 and 90-10 after we hit our 15% share coin quota. Okay, so have you ever been to a casino and played blackjack, Pega? Do you know how the blackjack dealer has like certain bounds of the rules that like they're playing against you? Okay, so we're kind of we're going to operate like that. So we will always take 70% of our print and we'll always put it in LP. Why? One, we are the DEX. Why wouldn't we deploy LP on our own DEX? Does that make sense? And 90-10 would be the most. 90 is all LP, and 10% is sales. And the reason we would never do 100 really is because these LP instruments do better with actual transaction volume, right? So like it's one thing to have the thing that collects swap fees, and then you can also swap through and collect swap fees. Every time you make a transaction, a whole bunch of other transactions kind of chain off of that. So the goal in the future, these price charts will always be moving. Does that make sense? Like they're not going to be boring price charts because we're connecting these tokens to like every single blue chip token in DLT. So wrapped Ethereum, wrapped Bitcoin, you fucking name it. They're not going to be like focused on. In fact, I think the deepest LP will be the ones that the bannerets manage. But yeah, it'll basically be, you guys are going to be figuring out later, and this will happen more in phase 2 and phase 3, but there will actually be dashboards on the DEX, or there'll be dashboards, at least on the Tomb Fork page, that actually shows you which wallets are actually claiming and putting LP out and which wallets are just dumping. Because it'll be from this Pega that you can kind of watch wallets and figure out, is this somebody who's on my team or is this somebody who's working against me? Does that make sense? So you'll actually be able to see which wallet is actually doing manual LPs and which wallets aren't. Does that make sense? This is how you kind of gauge whether or not you have real teammates. Does that make sense? And this is actually how it works. This is how the team is built. Like, oh, look, there are other wallets manually doing LP. Exactly. Yes, you understand it completely. And by the way, all of those, that gigantic LP you have, like you're allowed to sell that. You know what I mean? Like nobody can stop you from doing anything. In the future, like let's say you or one of the other bannerets, you have like an emergency expense, and you're like, hey, I need to like dump 20 grand of my LP. Like it's fine because the system will still repair itself, and you're being a good team player by disclosing that, hey, by the way, we might lose some total supply here because I have to cash out of this. But the thing is, the system will still repair itself from there. But as far as getting back to peg, it's fucking easy. What actually gets the game interesting and what actually starts determining whether bannerets get good at it is how good can the bannerets get at manually incentivizing the growth of liquidity. And by the way, there will be farms in phase 2, so there will be other things happening on PyreSwap. But during phase 1, after we get to the first prints of these things, you'll now realize without farms being there, as soon as a print happens, it's like all of the knights are front running each other to dump. Like they're not going to think about this at all because that's how it was back in the day. So they're all going to sell or they're going to buy more share coin, right? What happens if they all